Dear students, we are going to have an insightful interpretation of the chapter, that is the French Revolution, summarizing all the topics and subtopics herein as its content, focusing through a very short PPT video which is dedicated to all my dear ones. Please be with me all throughout the session. First of all, let us talk about the significance of the revolution. It started in the year 1789, led to the end of absolute monarchy in France. The ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity are taken for granted today all across the world. A society based on privileges was over and gave way to a new system of governance based on democracy. Finally, even the Indian freedom fighters were also greatly influenced by this revolution, along with many other countries in the world. So this revolution is treated as one of the most significant events in the world history. Let us introduce the chapter. This chapter is started with the demolition of the Bastille in Paris on 14th of July 1789, the symbol of hatred for all, as it stood for the despotic power of the king, tyrannical, autocratic power of the king. A people's militia was formed with the Third Estate group of people, and they broke into the Bastille and a number of government buildings in search of hoarded arms and ammunitions. The commander of the Bastille was killed and the prisoners were released, although there were only 7 of them. The days that followed were all witnessed with more rioting both in Paris and countryside, where most of them were protesting against the high prices of bread and other essential commodities. Now let us see about the French society during the late 18th century. French society in the 18th century was divided into 3 estates, and only the Third Estate group of people had to pay all sorts of taxes to the state in the form of taillis, to the churches in the form of titres, and even to the nobles in the form of feudal dues. The members of the first 2 estates, that is the clergy and the nobility, enjoyed certain privileges by birth, like exemption from paying any kind of taxes and the feudal privileges. It was about 90% of population was from the peasants community, who were obliged to render services to their lords, to work in their houses and fields, to serve in the army, and even to the construction of roads. Thus, the French society of estates was a part of the feudal system of the Middle Ages, which can also be termed as the old regime, the society and institution of France before 1789. And the economic condition of France was also in a very fragile condition. Long years of wars had drained the financial resources of France, including the cost of maintenance of an extravagant court at the immense palace of Versailles. Under the rule of King Louis XVI, France was in an acute economic crisis due to the fact that he helped the Americans in the War of Independence, which added more than $1 billion livres to a debt that had already risen to more than 2 billion livres. The state credit lenders also charged about 10% interest on the loans provided, so the king did not have other options. Rather, he was compelled to increase the taxes to meet the royal expenses. Then let us go on to the topic like the struggle to survive. The rapid growth of population in France led to an immense increase in the demand for food grains. So the price of bread, the staple diet of the majority, also rose rapidly, whereas the wages of the employees or laborers were not raised in proportionate to the rising prices. So the gap between the poor and the rich widened more and more. Such prevailing situation turned into the worst condition, with the bad harvesting due to the drought or hail, leading to a subsistence crisis. It is an extreme situation where the basic means of livelihood are endangered, which was very frequent in France, basically during the old regime. Now let us see how a subsistence crisis happens. It started with a bad harvest, scarcity of grain, rising food prices, the poorest can no longer buy bread, food riots, It takes to weaker bodies, disease and epidemics, increased number of deaths. So many. This is the chain that is followed by subsistence crisis, which was very common during the old regime in France. Then a growing middle class that ended to the privileges class. The 18th century France witnessed the emergence of a social group called the middle class, belonging to the merchants and the manufacturers, along with the professionals such as the lawyers or the administrative officials. This middle class also belonged to the third estate group of people who had become prosperous and educated, inspired with new ideas of freedom and equality from the great philosophers of France like John Locke, Rousseau and Montesquieu. They believed that no group in society should be privileged by birth. Rather, someone's social status and position must depend on his or her efficiency or merit. Then the outbreak of the revolution. The news that Louis XVI planned to impose further taxes to be able to meet the royal expenses generated anger and protest against the system of privileges, especially by the third estate group of people. But during the old regime, the monarch did not have the power to impose taxes without the consent of the Estates General. It was a political body to which the three estates sent their representatives. Under certain circumstances and compulsion, the king was bound to call together an assembly of the Estates General on 5th of May 1789 to pass proposals for enhancing the new taxes, even without carrying the protest from the third estate group of people. And this convocation of Estates General can be assumed as the immediate cause of the so-called French Revolution. Then the third estate group of people was represented by its more prosperous and educated members, totaling of 600, who had to remain standing in the assembly at the back of the sitting representatives of the first and second estates, numbering of 300 members. Earlier, the voting system was according to the principle that each estate had one vote. This time also, the King Louis XVI wanted to continue the same practice, but the third estate did not agree to that point and demanded the voting to be conducted by the assembly as a whole under the democratic principle of Rousseau, where each member would have one vote. But when the king rejected the proposal, the third estate walked out of the assembly in protest, and thereby bringing out the commencement of the historic French Revolution. They assembled on 20th June 1789 in the hall of an indoor tennis court in the grounds of Versailles and declared themselves as a national assembly under the leadership of Mirabeau and Abysses. In the oath-taking ceremony of the tennis court, the National Assembly had undertaken the responsibility of drafting a constitution for France that would limit the powers of the monarch, the powers of the king. And while the National Assembly was busy at Versailles drafting the constitution, the rest of the country, entire France, was smoldered with utmost chaos and turmoil. There was a bad harvest due to severe winter. The prices of bread rose higher and higher. The bakers exploited by hoarding supplies. The crowds of angry women stormed into the shops, and at the same time the king ordered troops to move into Paris, adding fuel to the turmoil. And as a result, it was on 14th of July 1789 the agitated crowd stormed into the Bastille and destroyed its existence. Then the peasants looted, hoarded grains, and burned down documents containing the records of manorial dues. A large number of nobles fled from their homes, and many of them migrated to other neighboring countries. Finding the situation out of control and sensing some intense disaster, King Louis XVI finally accorded recognition to the National Assembly, accepting his power to be limited by the Constitution. It was on 4th of August 1789 the Assembly passed a decree abolishing the feudal system of obligations and taxes. Tithis were abolished, lands owned by the church were confiscated, members of the clergy were forced to give up their privileges. Then France becomes a constitutional monarchy. So the National Assembly completed the drafting of the constitution in 1791, curbing and limiting the power of the monarch, where the powers of the government were assigned to the three organs of the government like legislature, executive and judiciary. And from now onwards, France became a constitutional monarchy. The constitution vested the power to make laws in the National Assembly, which was indirectly elected by the people. Only the men above 25 years of age who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of a laborer's wage were given the status of active citizenship, that is, the right to vote. The constitution began with a declaration of the rights of men and citizens, and it was the duty of the state now to protect each citizen's natural rights. Thus, the situation in France continued to be intense even during the following years of the formation of constitutional monarchy. It was because the King Louis XVI was not at all happy while signing the constitution and thereby limiting his own power. So he entered into secret negotiations with the kings of Prussia to bring back his absolute power of monarchy. On the other hand, the rulers of other neighboring countries of Europe also worried about the political development in France and made plans to send troops to put down the development of constitutional monarchy there in France. Therefore, the National Assembly voted in April 1792 to declare war against Prussia and Austria. Thousands of volunteers thronged from the provinces to join the army willingly. It was realized that this was a war of the people against the kings and aristocracies all over Europe. So, among the patriotic songs they sang was the Marseillaise, composed by the poet Roger de l'Isle, which is now the national anthem of France. Unfortunately, the Revolutionary Wars brought losses and severe economic difficulties to the people, leading to the loss of its popularity. Large sections of the people could realize the limitations of the constitution, which gave political rights only to the richer sections of the society. So, the political clubs are coming up to discuss the serious issues of the government policies, and among them the most successful one was the Jacobin Club under the leadership of Robespierre. The members of this club belonged mainly to the less prosperous sections of society, who were also known as sans-culottes, those without knee breeches, opposed to the nobles who wore the knee breeches. So, in the summer of 1792, the Jacobins planned an insurrection, a great rebellion against the king, of a large number of Parisians who were angered by the short supplies and high prices of food items. And finally, on the morning of August 10th, they stormed into the palace of Tuileries, massacred the king's guards, and held the king himself as hostess for several hours. Later, the newly elected assembly voted to imprison the royal family. From now onwards, all men of 21 years and above got the right to vote. Elections were held, and the newly elected assembly was called Convention. On 21st of September 1792, it abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. King Louis XVI was sentenced to death on 21 January 1793, and the Queen Marie Antoinette also met the same fate shortly after. Now let us see about the Reign of Terror. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as the Reign of Terror, as because Robespierre followed a policy of severe control and punishment. All those whom he saw as being enemies of the Republic, even members of his own party who did not agree to his methods, were all arrested, imprisoned, and then tried by the revolutionary tribunals, and if the court found them guilty, they were all guillotined. Thus, Robespierre pursued his policies so relentlessly that even his followers and supporters started to oppose him and wanted some moderation in his policies. Finally, he was convicted via court in July 1794, arrested, and on the next day itself he was sent to the guillotine. Then a directory rule came out in France. The fall of the Jacobin government allowed the wealthier middle class people to seize the power again in France. A new constitution was introduced which again denied the vote to non-property sections of society. This constitution provided for two elected legislative councils who appointed a directory and executive of 5 members. The directory rule was meant for as a safeguard against the concentration of power in a one-man executive as it was practiced under the Jacobins. However, the directors often clashed with the legislative councils, leading to a political instability in the country of France, and that paved the way for the rise of Napoleon, a military dictator in France. Then next topic is about, did the women have a revolution in France? Yes, the entire women community of France had to suffer a lot during the old regime as well as in the revolutionary era, being as in the form of passive citizens. Most women did not have access to education or job training. Their wages were lower than that of men. So, from the very beginning, women were active participants in the events of revolution which brought about so many important changes in French society. In order to voice their demand of equal political rights, they started their own political clubs and even newspapers. About 60 such clubs came up in France, while the Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was the most prominent one. In the early years of the revolutionary government, the women did enjoy some of the political rights as well as social rights, where schooling was made compulsory for all girls. But women's struggle for equal political rights, however, continued. It was during the Reign of Terror. The new government of Robespierre issued some laws ordering the closure of the women's clubs and banning their political activities in France. Many of them were arrested, even executed during the Reign of Terror. It was finally in the year 1946 that women of France won the right to vote. Then the next topic is about the abolition of slavery. It was one of the most important revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobin regime, that was the abolition of slavery in the France colonies in 1794. The National Assembly didn't dare to bring laws against the triangular slave trade, fearing opposition from businessmen whose income depended on it. But the abolition of slavery by the Jacobins did not last long, as just after 10 years it was reintroduced by Napoleon Bonaparte in France. Finally, it was abolished in French colonies in 1848. Then let us talk about the revolution and everyday life. Here you see the years following 1789 in France saw many changes in the lives of men and women. The revolutionary government issued some laws that translated the ideals of liberty and equality into everyday practice. One of the important of them was the abolition of censorship. Moreover, the Declaration of the Rights to Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. Newspapers, pamphlets, books, and printed pictures flooded the towns and even villages of France, where the issues and changes were highlighted in large numbers of the country. Plays, songs, and festive processions attracted large number of people over France. Then let us come to the conclusion of the chapter. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France. He set out to conquer neighboring European countries also. Initially, many people saw Napoleon as a liberator who would bring freedom for the people, they thought. But soon the Napoleon armies came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. So Napoleon lost his popularity in France. Finally, Napoleon was defeated in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, and Napoleon saw his role as a modernizer of Europe. He introduced many laws such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures. Many of Napoleon's revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws made lasting impact in Europe and even in the world. Now let us talk about the legacy of the revolution. The ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. These ideas spread from France to the rest of Europe, even in the entire world during the 19th century, where feudal systems were abolished. Even these ideas influenced people in the colonized India. Tipu Sultan and Raja Ram Mohan Roy were greatly influenced by the ideas of coming from revolutionary France and spread it in India for the growth of nationalism in the country. So thank you so much. I hope this video will help you to understand the chapter in a better manner, and the fact is that you need to go on into the depth of the chapter more and more to explore some new ideas. I believe you will do that. Till then, thank you so much. See you in the next video. Thank you.